Good evening again. Can everybody hear today? I think this is much better than last time, and I'll try to behave myself and stay close to the microphones. Thanks for coming through the spring crazy weather we had. And again, for those of you that may not have been here before, my name's Mark Saxon, and I'm here as part of the Society for Catholic Scientists to talk about this part of the Death to Life mission program. Somebody had a great suggestion of starting with a prayer, which if anybody would volunteer to do, if not, I can offer one very simply. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, be with us. Today, let us open our minds and our hearts and be a reflection of your peace and wisdom. Amen. Okay, last week we talked about the phenomena of near-death experiences, and we focused on what happened, and we saw that it started almost like a spark in the 20th century, where one investigator, which we talked about, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, began to notice some commonalities amongst people who were near death or dying. And then another investigator picked up on that, Dr. Moody. And then it began to get more formal when Dr. Ring picked up on the research. Each one of them had an independent series of patients where they noticed that the experiences seemed to be not only common among them, but it also had a vividness to it and a life-changing effect. Still, people doubted it, and that was part of the feel of the times. As we progressed into the late 80s and 90s, we had an investigator that we talked about down at the University of Virginia that started to really compile hundreds and thousands of these across cultures. And we ended up saying that these events just can't be passed off as hallucinations. And we described them, and I think you'll remember, as themes of encountering a being of light, a life review, travel through one's life, and a profound sense of peace, and an experience that was actually more real than reality. So that's where we left off. We looked at the study of these, and we determined that enough had happened by enough investigators that we just couldn't dismiss them. So what we're going to do tonight is take a look at the how of these phenomena. We'll see what happened scientifically and how this evolved to what we know today. So specifically, we'll be looking at what is the relationship between hypoxia, or the lack of oxygen, and near-death experiences. Can near-death experiences be modeled by psychoactive drugs like ketamine, LSD, or DMT? We'll talk about those. And then sort of come to the end with a perspective of what is consciousness. Is consciousness like an electric field that's generated with the moving of atoms and stuff? Or is consciousness another dimension or reality that we're part of, that we're connected to? And we're not going to answer that, but that's the debate that sort of underlies what we'll be talking about tonight. So we talked about Dr. Parnia. Dr. Parnia is currently the Director of Critical Care and Resuscitation at NYU Langone, and he's a pulmonologist who specializes in resuscitation. So every week he's involved in cardiac arrest, and his mission is actually to better understand what happens at the moment of death. So he is looking at it both as a physician and as a scientist, and he did a couple of remarkable things that are described in his books. He, first of all, convened an assembly of about 20 or 25 experts from around the world. He had physicians, he had philosophers, he had theologians, he had physiologists. And the thinking at the time was, now that we know that there's something going on, let's see if we can narrow it down, because if we narrow it down and make that question very specific, we can study it. So he set up guidelines, and the first thing he did is he renamed the phenomena. He said, instead of talking about near-death experiences, let's focus on people who are really dying, people whose hearts have stopped. Because that's where the puzzling things really start to happen at that extreme of life. He also created an AWARE study, which is an acronym, and I can't tell you exactly what but it's the study of awareness during resuscitation. And the idea is he was going to do a prospective study. So what does that term mean? A prospective study is one that goes forward in the future. And it's very important to scientists, because scientists say, we can look back at everybody's experiences in the past, but there's always a bias. I have a bias, everybody else has a bias, and it can be interpreted many different ways. But as scientists, we like to get that narrow definition and then go forward and say, we're going to set up an experiment and we're going to see what happens. And we're going to agree that if it turns out that our question or our hypothesis is proven, that's good. We'll see if somebody else can duplicate it. If it doesn't, it means that either we missed the mark or maybe what we were studying wasn't true. So let me first define a few terms. Cardiac arrest is important because it's the final step in the dying process, irrespective of cause, whether it's a slow death from cancer or Alzheimer's disease, whether it's a traumatic death. It all ends with cardiopulmonary collapse. And when that happens, you really have a transition where you lose consciousness, and death, the dying of cells, happens usually within 3 to 5 minutes. If you get to a certain point, your vital organs such as the brain, the kidneys, your sensory organs all begin to not only lose function, but eventually have irreversible damage. So Parnia talks about wanting to study these phenomena in what he called the gray zone of death. And what is the gray zone of death? If we look up at the slide, oh, I'm sorry, I haven't been advancing. My apologies. Okay. Okay, this is where we were at. What is the gray zone of death? Gray zone of death occurs at the moment of cardiac arrest, where the blood supply to the brain is stopped. Oxygen supplies rapidly diminishes, and at the same time that your oxygen supply is diminishing, your metabolic waste products, mainly carbon dioxide, is increasing. Both of these are not good. We're going to see why in a second. Cell damage begins and continues, and then resuscitation is possible up to a certain point, because you're accruing cell damage along this whole gray zone. When you get to a certain point, there's just too much damage. The cells, or the neurons, actually burst. They swell, and they lose their function, and they become unable to function. And at that point, resuscitation is not possible. So the thing that fascinated Dr. Parnia and many other investigators is people are having experiences in this gray zone of death where we're talking about lucidity. They're having vivid experiences that they can recall if they've been rescued just at this point and brought back to tell the tale. Now, as far as time goes, it depends on the conditions. It may be as little as 10 minutes when you pass from that point of cardiac arrest to the point of no return. It can happen in 12 to 24 hours if somebody's in an intensive care unit and is being fed by life support and supplementary oxygen and other aids. So how does this happen? On a cellular level, what's interesting is we have what I think is almost a miracle in itself is how oxygen is supplied to tissues. So if we look over here, we have an active brain, a brain with consciousness, and it's highly dependent upon two things. First, it has to have that steady supply of oxygen, and it has to have it in a very specific amount. Also, at the same time, you need to be getting rid of the waste products from metabolism. So we mentioned building up carbon dioxide. Well, the kind of miraculous thing is there's a molecule on the red blood cell, the heme molecule, that is specifically designed for this purpose. First, it carries oxygen, picks it up from the lungs, the oxygen binds to this cell, and then it travels to all different parts of the body, including the brain, and then if it gets into a tissue where there's too much carbon dioxide, it has a shift in conformation. It's like the posture changes where the oxygen is released and the carbon dioxide is bound. And so this process goes on forever and ever. This process takes less than a fraction of a second, occurs throughout our whole life. And this is what's really sustaining that delicate balance between carbon dioxide removal and oxygen supply to the vital organs. Okay. The human brain is the ultimate high maintenance organ. It only consists of about 2% of total body weight, but yet it takes 15% of the cardiac output. It's like it's hogging all of the oxygen. It's 20% of the body's oxygen consumption, 25% of the body's glucose consumption. If you ever wonder, sometimes you see that commercial where a person's kind of getting fuzzy and they say, I need a Snickers or something like that. The brain is really highly dependent on both glucose and oxygen. And it is designed to keep it well supplied by some very unique things about the circulation. So there's a lot of collateral circulation to the brain. What do we mean by that? It means that you have several branches, if you will, of the arterial tree. That means that your supply isn't limited to one vessel. You have multiple vessels, so that if one area of the brain is damaged, just like with the heart, you have at least a chance of having it fed with oxygen and to have circulation from another blood vessel. So this is, again, very tightly regulated. The normal pressure of arterial oxygen is about 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury. And I'm just going to, I know that's just a number now, but I want to reference that in a couple of slides. The normal cerebral blood flow is about 750 ml per minute. So 5 ml is what you have in a teaspoon. If I took this size of a syringe, that's about 20 ml. Just think of that 750 ml rushing through the brain, feeding it and removing its waste every minute. Now this is another unique feature of the circulation of the brain. There's an area called the Circle of Willis that feeds this collateral circulation. And it has, if you will, metabolic helpers built into the cells so that not only does the brain need adequate blood pressure and a blood flow, but there are little chemical sensors that actually exist within the blood vessels that help maintain autoregulation. And that's another term I'd like to define. Autoregulation means that you're going to have a steady supply of oxygen at the brain over a relatively broad range of mean arterial pressures. Remember we said that a normal was about at 100 millimeters here, and so we can get about as high as 150 or 60. We can get as low as 70. So let's take a look at what might happen when autoregulation is disturbed. We have a lot of room for variability. If it gets too high, we run the risk of having a stroke or to have cellular damage. And so that's going to be a problem. And we're going to suffer because we're going to impair the process of balancing oxygen and carbon dioxide content. If it gets too low, first there's a reserve capacity that's built into the brain. This is where I think the beauty of anatomy, the beauty of the body comes in. Where not only do you have your collateral circulation feeding autoregulation, but you have a reserve built in. But if the pressure continues to drop, then you get to this critical area where we call hypoperfusion. And that means that there's just not enough pressure, and there may be not enough blood carrying hemoglobin. Multiple things mean the tissue isn't getting fed. And so what happens when you don't feed the brain? Well, let's look at it clinically first. We can start up here. This is our normal, where we said 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury, and that's what we're experiencing right now. If we took our blood pressures, we'd probably have at least that much pressure that would be feeding our brain. If we dropped it down into the 60s, we wouldn't be able to concentrate. We'd have this impaired ability to perform complex tasks. Around 55, we have a short-term memory impairment. About 30, we have loss of consciousness. And then we get down to 15, which is almost about a 10 to 20% drop. Then we start having death of the tissue. Okay, so one of the things that come to mind is, well, what about resuscitation? Because when a person undergoes cardiac arrest, that blood supply is cut off, it drops to zero. And again, you have about 3 to 5 minutes. If you don't do anything, you're going to start that whole process going. Well, even when CPR is performed, according to guidelines, it can only deliver about 20% of normal blood flow to the brain. And overall survival, if you're outside of the hospital, your odds of surviving a cardiac arrest are about 10 to 12%. If you're in the hospital where you have some help of keeping your vital organs and your brain alive, survival's a little better, of 24 to 40% that you can survive cardiac arrest. It gets a little worse, and that's what we want to say. Well, can CPR actually impair, or how can CPR relate to brain function? This is a graph that shows signals from an EEG. An EEG picks up the electrical activity of your brain, and it correlates to consciousness. We said before, a high degree of signal means that your brain's really firing, you're concentrating. The lower it goes, your EEG changes. So in a normal person who's awake, this whole bar would be green. You start to lose function very quickly within about 0 to 10 minutes here. And as you see, as time goes on of CPR, where you're going 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes, you just lose that signal. And then eventually, this green area means the unconscious signals, which means your body is keeping itself alive even though you're not conscious. This more or less just drops to where it's nothing, and then you get to the point of no return. So let's stop for a second. People are having near-death experiences during cardiac arrest. You should be having a loss of consciousness because you have a lack of blood flow. Your brain should be losing its ability to be fed. Why is it that we're having experiences that are the same in one individual or very similar to another, and another in an impaired brain. Here's the second part that is really daunting during cardiac arrest. That balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide, that all stops. And as we said before, we get swelling of the brain tissue. The whole system of metabolism changes from one that's dependent on oxygen to one that's not. And then once you get to a certain point, the cells release lytic enzymes. That means it releases enzymes that it's going to break down its neighbors. And so you're actually self-destructing at that point. And then cellular death results. Now this will occur early in that zone of death. So this is why most people who undergo a cardiac arrest don't make it out of the hospital. And most people who do make it out of the hospital, it's not uncommon to have a neurologic function. So if you can get somebody who's resuscitated and they're restored, their physiology, and they can actually live to tell the tale, that's remarkable. Near-death experiences, by Parnia's estimate, tend to occur in about 10% of the people who survive. So maybe 1 out of 100, 1 out of 100, 1 out of 10 to 1 out of 100. Does this mean that it's just a freak event? Well, no, because there are several things that happen in addition to this. If this process goes so far, you're going to impair your autoregulation. That whole process of maintaining that is less if you're a smoker, if you're a diabetic, if you're just on in years. A lot of things can happen that are going to compromise that whole process. Does the brain typically return to normal after resuscitation? Well, it all depends. One of the things that's really critical is that there's a part of the brain called the hippocampus that's involved in memory formation. So if you're going to survive a cardiac arrest, it's important that you haven't destroyed a lot of cells in the hippocampus, because people know that in general, if you have damage to this hippocampus area, that you have memory impairment. You're not able to have recollections. So it is pretty well studied, and we know that these certain type of neurons, they're called CA1 neurons, are very important for autonoetic consciousness. What does that term mean? Autonoetic means you're able to project into the future, or you're able to recall in the past. So what's a person doing during an NDE? They're saying, I had a life review. And then they're saying, not only to have a life review, but perhaps I encountered dead relatives or people that I didn't know had passed on. The other thing is, we said there were veridical experiences. There's accounts of people being resuscitated in the operating room or in an emergency room that are saying, yes, I knew I was resuscitated because, like we talked last week, I could see somebody had sticky notes on the computer that was over in the corner of the room. Or somebody made a remark that I remember. So these are the really baffling things about these near-death experiences that can't be explained, should not be possible when we look at normal physiology. Okay. Can near-death experiences in the dying brain be modeled? So now we're back into the 1980s, and again, they're starting to pick up a momentum to study these events. And there's some pharmacologists that say, I know some drugs that produce experiences that seem to be very close to near-death experiences. And we're going to look at what they said in just a second. Let's stop for a second and think, if we were going to make a model of death, what would it have to be from what we just learned?
We would say, first of all, we said cardiac arrest is the final common pathway. So if we started with cardiac arrest, we could enter this gray zone of death, and we know what happens there. And so a near-death model would be somebody who could take us this far where we just don't get it to the point of no return. And then we haven't suffered from the cell damage, and then we can return, and people have these tales that they describe. Okay, so this is the time course for recalled experience of death. And again, it can be anywhere from maybe a few minutes to maybe 24 hours, 12 hours or so, depending upon what's happening. We know that when a person's in the hospital, they have help. They're being fed oxygen, they may have an IV, they have drugs, things that can help improve their chances of resuscitation. And this is what Dr. Parnia studies. He says, my job is to understand resuscitation, and we're looking at the physiology, how many more people can we turn around, and yet we keep hearing these stories. And not only me, but my colleagues from across the country, also are encountering these stories. So if we had a model, we would want it to fulfill these criteria. Now, Carl Jansen was a physiologist, physician in New Zealand right about the time. And he made an extraordinary claim in the literature. He said, I'm very interested in ketamine. He said, ketamine is a unique drug. He said, first of all, if you give somebody ketamine, it doesn't start to shut down the brain. It actually preserves autoregulation. And the responsiveness to carbon dioxide is preserved, so we're getting rid of those waste elements. Cerebral blood flow is increased. And so even though you have an increased metabolic rate, this is a very unique drug. And we see that in the anesthesia. If most anesthetic drugs, if you give somebody a gas, it's like turning off the lights. Everything shuts down. Give somebody ketamine, what happens is they usually develop a blank stare. They become insensitive to pain. Their eyes get very wide, and they're in what we call a catatonic state. You're able to work on them. They may even respond, but they won't have any memory of what's going on. This is the drug that fascinated Dr. Jansen. And he said that ketamine also has some other pharmacological properties. First of all, it works on an area of the hippocampus. It produces a cataleptic state, as we said. And sometimes in low doses of ketamine, you're going to have auditory, visual, and proprioceptive hallucinations. So we thought, how is this not the answer? We can give people ketamine. We know where it works in the brain. We have an idea of the chemistry and the physiology of the brain. Maybe we can understand it if we administer ketamine to patients and see what happens. 2 years pass. And first of all, again, he made some comments. Here are some of the comments that Jansen made that are still in print. He says, features that have been associated with near-death experiences can be reproduced by the intravenous administration of 50 to 100 milligrams of ketamine. That's pretty specific. Ketamine administered by IV injection in appropriate doses, he said, can reproduce all of the features of a near-death experience that have commonly described in most cited works. And again, the near-death experience is an important phenomena that can be safely reproduced by ketamine. This is what I was talking about before, and it thus can be investigated by experiment. Would you notice how confident that is? That's really sure. He's going to explain. And this is where maybe I'm telling some tales out of school. Scientists sometimes overstate things. When I was a grad student, I studied a peptide, and it was one of the very few places actually in the country that studied this, and it studied blood flow mechanisms. And I went to my mentor when I was going to publish my first paper. And he said, what are your conclusions? And he said, well, I'm going to conclude that in a model using mice, that we're able to get 20% vasodilation that lasts for 10 hours with this peptide. It was called CGRP. And he said, no. I said, don't do that. He said, I want you to put down, this is the first investigation we know of in the world that shows vasodilation with CGRP. I don't know what happens, over the whole world. He says, yes, but as far as we can tell. And the idea is that scientists many times may have to defend their theory, whether it's right or wrong. And so, could Jansen maybe have been overstating things? Let's see what well, first of all, let's look at some of the criticisms. Shortly after he made these claims, other people began remarking on this. And they said, first of all, ketamine experiences resemble delirium, agitation, and confusion. They're not lucid. And this is what I would have said, because in my own practice, it's a small niche of anesthesiology, but I probably administered ketamine, again, maybe, I would say 10,000 times over 30 years. Most of the time, well, first of all, I've never seen somebody come out of ketamine and say they had a life-changing experience. And this is true of other anesthesiologists. Very few people will say, ketamine changed my life. I am willing to go die for what I saw when I was under ketamine. Now, it is reported sometimes people who are drug abusers will report that they've had unusual experiences, and they do abuse ketamine. But the thing is with drug abusers, there's a psychological construct to people who do that. In other words, people can inhale organic solvents. They can go underneath your sink, and they can take toluene, they can take glue, and they can get high. And they also have experiences. The thing about these experiences is that there doesn't seem to be the commonality. They're not generally reproducible. They tend to be vague, and they don't carry a temporal sequence. People don't say, I left my body and I did. But with ketamine, with its autonoetic impairment, you could see where maybe we were getting somewhere. Okay. So this is the same investigator 2 years later. Let's listen to what he has to say. I am no longer opposed to a spiritual explanation of near-death experiences, as my article in this response would suggest. The apparent emphasis on matter over non-matter contained within this article no longer accurately represents my attitudes. But what had happened is he was talking to other scientists from around the world when he published this. And they said, hey man, let me tell you what I saw. Here's what I found in my laboratory. And so he's toning it back a little bit. He says, I now believe that there is the most definitely as a soul that is independent of experience, and it exists when we begin and may persist when we end. Ketamine is a door to a place we cannot normally get to. It is definitely not evidence that such a place, it does not exist. And he says, I regret my past emphasis on the overriding importance of theories of matter as they stood in the 1980s. So why is it important that Jansen said this? Jansen spent 10 years studying ketamine and later actually put out a book to explore other theories. But I show this to say sometimes you or I may not know that. We may read something in the newspaper and we may see it stated very emphatically. I can explain near-death experiences from ketamine. Well, maybe not. But very few people go back to the journal and get the whole perspective. One other drug is interesting, and this drug is DMT, N-N-dimethyltryptamine. Tryptamine is a natural amino acid that exists in the brain. if you do some chemical modulations, you can actually bind to tissues in the brain. And this, it kind of gives you an idea of how this could be a psychoactive drug. Well, now we have a physician called Richard Strassman. He's associate professor out at the University of New Mexico, and his expertise was hallucinogenic substances. So he studied DMT. And he actually made a scale, which is a good scientific thing to do. He said, we're going to try to be an objective assessment of all of these experiences, and we're going to examine the psychedelic experiences associated with drugs. And he again compared near-death experiences used in psychedelic drugs and religious practices. You may not be, well, you probably may be aware that certain religions, like within Native Americans and Eastern religions, actually use drug-induced experiences as part of their religious rituals. And so, like psilocybin or ayahuasca and DMT are all drugs that have been used over centuries to induce these hallucinations. Okay, does DMT model the near-death experience? It's also a drug that works in that part of the brain of the hippocampus that has the neurons like ketamine did that are involved in out-of-body experiences, involved in recall. It's actually generated by a little gland called the pineal gland, and people now had another theory. They said, now we can understand it. What happens is when you die, the cell bursts, and the pineal gland releases all of this DMT, and that's what causes the near-death experiences. However, upon further review, yes, DMT does produce a short, intense, otherworldly type of experience. However, the association of the amount of DMT that exists naturally in your body is, at a minimum, 1/100th of the dose needed to produce this experience, and it's more like 1/1000 or 1/10,000. Very small. And you can take anything in a small dose. You know, there's a saying in pharmacology, dose makes the poison. If you have enough rat poison, it'll kill you. We all eat small amounts of rat poison, very minor concentrations in our processed food that has no effect. Well, the amount of DMT that's actually manufactured in the pineal gland is not enough to reproduce these experiences that that people were getting in their rituals. However, they did have some interesting features. So, for example, they said 94% of them experienced at least one feature, such as an out-body experience, tunnel and light, were absent from these. And again, approximately 50% of the sample, out of only 36 that he studied, reported encounters, not with people, but with a non-human entity. So there is some difference. But we can look at this a little further. Are these truly modeling near-death experience? We're going to look at it in two ways. Let's look at the phenomena first. So first, this is a type of a plot that plots an experience to a cause. And if you're looking for something that exists among a large group of people, you want to see a thick band with these experiences. So for example, here, undergoing an educational reevaluation of life, what this means is that this happened in a lot of people, because this is the number of people that experience them over here, and this is the phenomena. So if you see a broad band that goes to all different types of people, it means that it's shared by a lot of people. The bigger the band, the more people shared it. So for example, the perception of separation from the body, that is a big band. returning home again, the perception of heading towards a destination. All of these are what we associate with the recall experiences of death. This is what we find with drug-induced experiences with DMT. We find a one-to-one relationship. One person says, I felt like I was in a safe place. I encountered humanoid beings. This is something in this sample of 36 that was shared by 2 people. Everything else is just a very unique experience. So we're not seeing that commonality across subjects like we do with the near-death experiences. Okay, so let's summarize in that. We have a phenomenon. We have active dying. What's happening? We have ischemia and hypercarbia. That means lack of oxygen and increased carbon dioxide. It affects the entire brain. Does it produce an out-body experience? Yes, it does. But the characteristics of these are that you have lucid, sequential experiences, like we talked about last week. With ketamine, works on a different mechanism. It's very specific. Does it produce an out-of-body experience? Yes. This tends to, again, be an excitatory type of response in the brain. DMT works on another system, works into that critical area of the brain. This also produces an out-of-body experience. These tend to produce hallucinations or delusionals. They're more of a model of psychosis. The second thing we want to look at, remember we said what were the criteria if we needed a good model? Do any of these patients taking ketamine or DMT, are they in cardiac arrest? No, they're not. They're having normal brain function. Do they enter the gray zone of death? Do they have neurological tissue destruction? No, they don't. Do they have any encounter or feeling of coming up against a point of no return? No. So just on those criteria now, we can safely say that so far today, from everything that people have proposed, no matter how confident you may have seen their claims, we can't model near-death experiences by looking at what happens with a single neurotransmitter or a drug. Okay, so why don't we just close with a few thoughts here then. From materialists, again, these are people who say, well, the mind is like a computer. You can look at this in 2 different ways. If the mind is like a computer, they might say, well, your consciousness is like the RAM of your computer. Okay, who made the RAM? Who created the software? So that's not really a compelling argument. The other thing is there's a state generated from the hardware. In other words, if you have enough connections and interconnections, you're going to spontaneously form consciousness. That's a really hard thing to prove. I mean, does it sound plausible to you? This is a quote from Dr. Parnia, who again continues his research today. Consciousness, he believes, is suspended, not obliterated during a near-death experience. In this regard, it is analogous to anesthesia. What he was meaning is that when you undergo anesthesia, you don't reach a point of no return. You return with normal function because your normal physiology has been maintained by performing anesthetic care. Let's look at it from maybe a broader philosophical point of view. Last week we said that the goal of science was to get a very specific question to make sure all the pieces fit together. If we were going to say that consciousness developed as a property of matter, we've got a long way to go. Probably lots of puzzles. It's just not plausible. There is a faith tradition that, if you can boil it down, makes one claim. So we are part of something bigger. There is a divinity, and that we share some part of that. So with this painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, it shows God in the transmission, I believe it's with David there, I'm not sure on my art. Does it seem plausible to you that we could be inspired from a realm or injected with life or share in life that is beyond what we can touch and see and feel? Or is it more plausible that someday, somehow, all the pieces are going to come together perfectly and we'll have a scientific explanation of our being? There's I believe it's the 15th century, William Occam was a monk and a philosopher who proposed a principle for scientists. He's called Occam's razor. And I'm oversimplifying it, but he says many times if you're looking at something, follow the simplest path or the most direct path, because that's normally what tends to be true.
Great if any of you are philosophers, I'm sure you'll
Want to comment on that oversimplification. All right, and then just a couple of things. Last week we said, is there a new emerging partnership between science and faith? And we said, look at this. If you look at this in this direction, this looks like a duck. If you look at it in this direction, it looks like a rabbit. If you look at a phenomena or something in your field, so much depends upon your perspective. Scientists are very good at their materialistic perspectives. I believe in science, but I also believe in faith. Could it be that the best, most holistic picture we get of phenomena like near-death experiences is when we can have faith, reason guided by faith, when we can have a blend of those two perspectives? Then do we get the whole picture. We said before is when we tend to get down on a scientific level, it's as if we had a team of blind men discovering an elephant. The guy who's examining the trunk says, I think I found a tree trunk. And this guy says, I think I found a snake. And this person says, I don't know what I found here. Well, you need that broad perspective from all of your mind, all of your soul, to really understand a phenomena. So, how do we sum up? Dying is a process. That's one of the things that we know from the work of Parnia, with a duration that varies across individual circumstances. In cardiac arrest, that can last for minutes or hours. Near-death experiences and recalled experiences of death are not hallucinations. They are not fully explained by the effects of drugs or metabolic abnormalities. Electrical activity of the brain consistent with lucidity has been observed and documented during cardiac arrest, which led Dr. Parnia to say, I want people to realize that there is evidence that there is survival after death. It says it's painful to me and other investigators that people are afraid. And there's no good reason to just blindly believe, as a lot of the deterministic thought of the 20th century would tell you, that there is nothing. There's no evidence for nothing. You're a fool if you think there is. And again, the relationship between consciousness and its relationship to brain function and resuscitation is ongoing. It remains undiscovered. It's actually a fantastic new frontier. Okay, that's what I have. Are there any questions? I'm going to walk around if you have a question so that I can hear you better. I know I had a little trouble hearing last time. Does anybody have any comments or questions from the presentation? Yes, sir.
So I did review these books.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of books that I read. One question I was saying for a short period of time
Yes, I have. The remark, let me repeat it, is one of the remarks made, I believe you referenced Moody and others, say that there's an elasticity to time when you get to the extremes of life. For example, when you get to death, what seems like maybe a few minutes, maybe an hour, 2 hours or so. So in other words, time may be plastic. So this is something that not only has shown up in our investigation of near-death experiences, but that's sort of what Einstein was saying in his theory of relativity, that at the extremes of being, that the relationship between matter and mass is not as fixed as we think it is. So that was one of the things that the investigators found, is they said, yes, there doesn't seem to be a correlation in the events. One of the things that Dr. Grayson said that always particularly struck him is he had a patient who had died in the hospital and had no resuscitation at all, and was there for at least 15 minutes. So what we know is after 15 minutes, you should be dead. There should be a point of no return. That patient came back and actually could recall things. Now, we don't know why. Physiologically, we know that something allowed her return. But the other thing is that people describe this sequence that seems like you leave the body first, that you have encounters, conversations, etc., and you come back. But there does not seem to be a correlation to the length of the resuscitation or the period of unconsciousness. So yes, that is also reported. Okay, anybody else have any thoughts, questions, or experiences? Yes. That's so beautifully said. Thank you. I'd like to just pick up on one of the things you said. People think science and faith are at loggerheads. If you look at history, right around the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church actually kept science alive, or scholarship alive, for a long time. There was not always this rivalry between faith and science that we perceive today. Furthermore, there's people that are scientists that you may surprise you. Isaac Newton, Father Lemaitre was a Jesuit priest who actually initiated the theory of the Big Bang, creation of the universe. Several people see no conflict at all between evolution and faith. Yes, people speculate why, but we're going through a period of history where it seems like from about World War II on, up until recently, there's been a strong inclination towards atheism. So you see this in people like Carl Sagan, Daniel Dennett, several others who are very demonstrative. They make very compelling presentations, but they don't get very deep. But if you look through history, and if you really study it, we can't answer those questions. We don't have that type of certainty. But the point I wanted to make The Society of Catholic Scientists have two principles. They say, we're not going to do revisionist history with church doctrine. In other words, there's a tradition that has existed for 2,000 years that we embrace. And we're going to believe that. We also believe the traditions of science, where it's gotten us. And so we're still going to believe in scientific proof, and we believe that those are compatible. So again, there's many other things besides near-death experiences that we can talk about. So I wanted to, if any other thoughts or questions, thanks so much for those insights. Last week somebody asked about something was on the slides. So being an academic, I made handouts. So if you like, these are my slides from the past two presentations. There's references. On the very last slide, you have my email address. So if the print's too small and you want an electronic copy, email me. Edith said that you're welcome to email the church or contact the church office, and we'll get a copy to you. And this has some of the literature references and citations. So if you want to do further investigation on your own, you're welcome to them. So I will just leave these up here. But thank you so much for coming out. And oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Sure. Yes. Yes, the question is do people choose to come back? And there's a spectrum of experiences. So first of all, not everybody's near-death experience is the same, but there's enough of them among people that there's that commonality. Quite a few people have reported that they did encounter either a person they knew or the light or whatever that said this is not your time. And there's a matter of fact with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she was the most demonstrative. She said in her study of about 100 of her patients, nobody ever said they enjoyed coming back to their body. And there's another one that's in the handout. I don't think I referenced her, but she's a physician, an orthopedic surgeon who was trapped underwater for about 30 minutes going kayaking, had a near-death experience, and it said it completely changed her life. And she said for the longest time she didn't talk about not wanting to return because she had a young daughter and she didn't want her daughter to think that she didn't want to come back and be her mom. So yes, those kind of things, it's quite common that people don't want to come back. Lots of stories. Let me talk about one reference that I don't have in there. There's a book published. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it at bookstores called the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences. And again, it's edited by Bruce Grayson's team that we talked last time. You can read hundreds of accounts, and I'd encourage you to do so if you're curious. Yes, sir.
Has there been any difference in the type of near-death experience people would work based on the circumstances of that near-death experience as opposed to how you're able to people survive a long time underwater or cold, outside of Germany and the message, to prevent self-death and things like that. People live in those circumstances, freezing to death, drowning. Is there any difference in the near-death experience?
That's a great question. Just to make sure everybody heard, is there any correlation between the way a person dies and the type of near-death experience they have? Is that here? Okay. I'm not aware of any. I am aware of several differences. So one thing is not all near-death experiences are pleasant. There's about 10 or 15% that are not. Also, but the majority are, and you know, nobody really has an explanation for that. Not all of them have the features, but the most common features are the light, the being, the sense of love. Those are the most common features of those reports. And I don't think it's tied to the way people died, or at least it hasn't been described yet. Did you ask me the question about EEG last time? If you want, I'm welcome to talk later. We can maybe talk a little more detail about that. Yes?
The question I have would be along the lines of the question that we just asked. Is there any documentation or studies done of near-death experiences with those that are attempting suicide?
Again, yes, there are. Yes. If you want, I'll try to pull that reference for you if you want to email me. The general feeling that I recall is that people, not always, but often do not have a good experience when attempting suicide. So, again, I'd have to follow up on that, but that does seem to be a theme that there's I remember reading about the sense of regret in people who do attempt suicide. It's the minority of cases, but I'd have to refer you to the actual anecdotes. Yes. I'm looking forward next week to hearing the hospice presentation. I was personally really moved by Dr. Kubler-Ross. If you get a chance to read some of her accounts in working with the death, people who are close to death. And so, again, thank you for your interest. It's been an interest and passion of mine, and I'm just really grateful that we could share that.